Hello everyone, and welcome back to our talks on the Exalted Treatise. Today we continue the exploration of a very long section on misdeeds or demerits, the things that you shouldn't do. And the sentences that we will be exploring today are, as stated here, confusing right and wrong, and rejecting what is right and following the contrary. So there's a bit of a progression between these two sentences. The very first sentence is really is based on limited understanding and study of these classical texts, so much so that we are uncertain, we're confused about what we should be doing. The second sentence is when we have a clear picture, but of course one's understanding is still not comprehensive enough to really follow through and practice. And therefore it says that, even in the face of knowing that this is something that we should be doing, we still do the opposite. So on the basis of this idea of a lack of understanding and learning, I think it's important to explore our ideas of learning, and particularly when we start out from the very outset to understand what it is we're learning. And today I want to explore a bit more about this idea of Confucianism. So there are very strong parallels between Confucianism and Taoism. And for many people today, there are some misconceptions about Confucianism. So Confucianism, there are many different faces and you could say forms of Confucianism today. For one, it is a field of research studied throughout many of the major universities around the world, often as part of the Faculty of Humanities, the Department of East Asian Studies or Chinese Studies. There's this focus on what is Confucianism. And as you can see from the pictures here, various bronze artifacts, paintings, etc. And oftentimes there's this emphasis on situating the thoughts through a particular thinker, through a particular period of time in history. And so the study of Confucianism is then conflated with the study, a historical study. So looking back, like when we walk through a museum, looking back at a particular time and place, which is far removed from anything that is happening in our lives. And, as soon as we walk out of the museum, we leave all of that knowledge behind, in the sense that it's just curious, in one particular moment, but nothing to do with our everyday lives. And this is very different from how Confucius conceived of these teachings and these ideas. So when we look at the Analects, in the very top passage, Confucius explains that the Zhou dynasty, or the dynasty that the period of time that he was alive, called the Zhou dynasty, this dynasty itself surveyed and learned from the previous two dynasties, so the Xia dynasty and the Ying-Shang dynasty. But what they did was that they didn't completely conform to those traditions. They appropriated, adapted those traditions to their times. Now, Confucius lived about 500 years into the Zhou dynasty, and he would often sort of hark back and really praise the founding fathers of this particular dynasty. And so when he says, I follow the Zhou, I follow the early Zhou dynasty kings and their particular traditions and ideas. And so in this passage, you can already see that there's a critical evaluation and appraisal of tradition. It's not simply conforming and adhering to things in a rigid fashion. And this is even more clearer in the second passage at the bottom, in which one of the best students of Confucius, Yan Yuan, asks about how to go about ordering the state. This was kind of a very practical question. As a leader, the community, or as a state, how is it that we can do the best for the people? Confucius's answer is to use the calendar of the Xia dynasty, to use the mechanics of the chariots from the Ying Shang dynasty, wear the caps. So this is sort of the attire and ritual clothing and rules, regulations of the Zhou dynasty. And as for the music, to go reach back even further in time, the Shao dynasty, and also the early Zhou dynasty, the Wu music. Because you can see here, he says in the first passage that he generally follows the founding fathers of the Zhou dynasty. But in the second passage, he is already telling us that, there are things that he would pick and choose. There is this critical evaluation and understanding of what's best for our times, the contemporary times. Let's look back in history. Let's learn from the past and use it for the present and for the future. So the kind of learning that Confucius advocated was about the here and now, was not simply just a academic study of what happened in the years before. So to simply view Confucianism as a historical study would be inappropriate, given what Confucius himself said. There's also another form of Confucianism, which is to look at it in terms of its rituals and its and to see Confucius as a deity to be worshipped. So there are a few pictures here of Confucian temples. The photo on the right is from Korea. It's quite an elaborate ceremony in which, of course, they dress up in the robes, traditional robes. The instruments that they're using are traditional musical instruments as well. And, if you go touring in some of these East Asian countries, these are some of the sites that you might visit. And from these sites, people might get the misconception that perhaps Confucianism is some sort of, through the ceremonies, the rituals and rites, some sort of religious faith. And, certainly Confucianism is also studied as a religion. But interestingly, when Confucianism was first sort of made, the Jesuit missionaries sort of made contact with China in around the 16th, 17th century, and they translated the Confucian canon, for example, the 4 books, into Latin. And, the first sort of European contact with these texts and this thought was through these Latin translations. Well, very interestingly, the Enlightenment thinkers at that time in Europe noted with great admiration that Confucianism was not a religion in the sense of the European faiths, in the sense that it did not have a supreme divine being that was the source of all moral authority, where all the moral doctrines originate from. But rather, it was of the understanding that there is something within us that is this source of moral authority, and also, is part of the cosmos. So there's no sort of supreme being. So it's not a religion in the sense of the European, as having parallels with the European faiths. So again, this is another form of Confucianism. Here you can see that Confucius was very clear. He said, well, all these different ceremonies, these rituals, what are they all about? And he's asking us to reflect. Is it just these jade sort of implements that they put on the altars and the silks that they have to wear? And in terms of the music, is it just the drums that they have to hit or the bells that they have to hit? Is it just these instruments? So even at that time, Confucius was already lamenting that people would just participate in these ceremonies for the sake of the ceremony without realizing its underlying value and the learning that is part of the ceremony. What are you meant to get out of it? So it wasn't just about this superstition or some sort of faith. In another passage, Confucius is even clearer. Here, another student, Zilu, is asking Confucius about how to deal with higher beings or beings from other realms like gods and spirits. And Confucius, whilst not denying or negating that these other beings exist, he tells Zilu on no uncertain terms that we have to prioritize. Let's work on the here and now. The people around us, the people that we have contact with on a daily basis. How do we relate to them? Let's work on that before we start working on the beings that we can't see, these spirits. In the same conversation, Zilu also asks about death. And Confucius provides a similar response in which he says, well, let's work on how we live our lives now before we talk about the end of life. Because if we live our lives in the right way, through this cultivation, then the end result will often be a positive one. So he's not denying that, whether something happens after death or what happens at that point, but he's saying, well, let's work on the practical aspects. Let's be practical. Let's be pragmatic, and think about the issues that we're facing right here, right now. So, in fact, the idea of Confucianism as a religion is current, but we have to also, when we read the text, we realize, well, Confucius was not emphasizing that particular point. He was asking us to study for how we live our lives. And then, often these days as well, so we've talked about how Confucianism can just often be considered some sort of academic study, religious faith, but also even as part of Chinese philosophy. Now, this picture is a snapshot from one of the earliest translations by the Jesuits of the 4 books, as well as other writings of Confucius, or attributed to Confucius. And they named him the first philosopher of China. And at that time, of course, philosophy was a Western term. The Chinese did not necessarily think of these different traditions as some sort of philosophy. These days, of course, sinologists, specialists who study the Chinese language and culture, often talk about Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism as philosophies. But they almost always start off by defending it, because the philosophy that's taught in universities these days, kind of analytical philosophy, is very different from what we read in the Analects and other early ancient texts of Confucian and these other traditions. So is it a philosophy? Remains a lingering question. But what we certainly do know is that it was a form of study. It was a form of learning. But we also have to be clear about this learning. Again, I refer to the Analects, and this conversation makes it quite clear. Duke Ai, who was the leader of the state of Lu, so where Confucius was born, one of the feudal domains in the Kingdom of China at the time, he asks Confucius, or sort of consults Confucius, on this idea of this, what we're meant to be learning, this idea of study. And he says, well, out of your students, you have many students, who do you think is the most dedicated, who loves their learning? And Confucius replied that there was one student in particular who we met earlier, Yan Hui, who's pictured here. And Confucius praises him for his love of learning. But let's be very specific. Let's be clear about, what did Confucius praise Yan Hui for? If you look at the next lines, he doesn't really talk about Yan Hui, how intelligent he was, how he really had the gift of the gab, was great in writing essays or arguing his point, or giving oral presentations, or very, very learned in terms of the scholarship that he knew. None of these things seem to be what Confucius praises Yan Hui for, not only in the Analects, but in other texts as well. He points out two salient traits of Yan Hui that are the result, you could say, of his great learning, his dedication to his learning. And these are the fact that he never intensifies his anger. Now, this is a bit of a strange translation, which I will explain. What it's saying, based on the Chinese, is that through the learning, Yan Hui was able to use it in his daily life. Whenever he felt himself having a tinge of this sort of frustration or annoyance, he'd be immediately able to detect it. And rather than letting it escalate to the point of, this anger being manifest in his words or actions, he'd be able to immediately diffuse this frustration inside. So you can see this is a very important and very useful skill. That not only is it just sort of allowing that anger to stay within and, trying to be friendly on the outside. In fact, what Confucius is saying is that Yan Hui would always be able to detect his emotions, and be able to diffuse it. On top of that, Yan Hui was able to evaluate himself, reflect on his mistakes, and not repeat them. So you can see that, these are very useful skills. And the result of his dedication to this form of learning. So you can see already that this learning is more than just some sort of book learning. Confucius explains that this is a form of learning it is about improving oneself. And he particularly tells us that in the past, in his times, people in the past would often learn to improve themselves. Whereas even during his time, there were people who were already learning simply for their own self-advancement, for their careers, for money, for fame, just to impress others, and show off, rather than actually progressing and cultivating themselves. Now, this is in the time of Confucius. And certainly when we look at the history of education throughout China, and the establishment of, an examination system, which would lead on to, official government positions, then you can see, of course, that there's even greater temptation to think of education just as a path to a brilliant career, to fame and fortune as a government official. So, there were, you could say, dichotomous aims and objectives of education throughout Chinese history, despite what we know about this idea of Confucianism. That it's, very, from its origins, Confucius thought of the learning as something for one's self-improvement and the improvement of one's character, not just simply one's skills or knowledge. So in a nutshell, we really have to be clear about this kind of study and learning, so that we know we don't confuse what's right and wrong. If someone says, oh, let's learn this so that we can write great essays, or we can write, we can give great presentations. Well, actually, the point is what comes before that, which is through our own cultivation, and then to be able to share this with others. So Confucian learning, in a nutshell, is a lifelong learning. It's something that we do throughout our lives, not just simply in primary school or university, but really to help us uncover our potential, innate sort of abilities, this great character that we have within all of us. And then it's about improving ourselves as well as our relationships with those around us, as Confucius said, those in our family, in our community, etc. So it is an art of living. And I really like the words of Harvard professor Michael Pewitt when he explains that this Confucianism is something that is very down to earth. He says, it's about how I can become a better person, how I can relate to those around me better, and how I can live a better life. He uses those exact words to explain that, this is not just any normal learning, but something that helps us improve ourselves. So, if we've been learning this for some time, the important question to ask ourselves and to evaluate is, are our lives better? And when I say better, I don't mean in the sense of being rich and famous. I'm talking about better as in, understanding ourselves and our weaknesses, making the right decisions, knowing the difference between right and wrong so that we can make the right decisions. And, as a result, we can have more meaningful and rewarding relationships with the people around us. How do we relate to the people around us? Is that improved? All of these are indicators and markers of how we've progressed in this learning. And as I said, the different forms of Confucian learning can, in many ways, has parallels with Taoist and Buddhist learning today, and how Venerable Master Chin Kung, through the establishment of the academy, was one of the main purposes was to really reinvigorate and sort of bring back or continue and preserve this form of learning, a learning that is also about practice and application for our lives today, so what some might call a humanistic learning and education, because it is about human lives. It's about how we relate to others. So this form of learning is something we have to be very clear about. Learning and living, theory and practice, it all sort of complements each other and comes together. Now, as I said, for many people it might be quite obvious at the beginning of their studies, but as they study, particularly in Chinese history, there's this pressure from society, from family to get ahead in life, and to learn simply to write good essays, pass exams, and get a job as a government official. And interestingly, by let's say the 12th century, there was a need to re-emphasize and reorientate this Confucian learning. And a key scholar who really spearheaded this movement was Zhu Xi, so a very well-known Confucian scholar of the 12th century. And the movement that he sort of led was what we now call Neo-Confucianism, a sort of like Neo-Platonism, in the sense that it's sort of bringing back and recovering these traditions, and sort of the idea that learning is about developing ourselves and improving ourselves. And interestingly, Zhu Xi, he established various academies. Very famous one called the White Deer Grotto Academy, lists out very simple sort of outline or curriculum, you could say, for what he thought of should be the focus of Confucian learning. So it's very short, and I'd like to share it with you so that, we're all clear about, and not confusing right and wrong, and being and understanding what we're learning. So very, very simply, he says there's 5 instructions. And really what he's saying are the 5 relations. Okay, so it's listed here between parent and child, leader, team member, between partners, seniors and juniors, and between friends. So these are what we are quite familiar with, the 5 relationships that runs through Chinese culture, Chinese traditions, and not only Taoism, but also Confucianism. And Zhu mentions that, from as early as the former kings, the King Yao and King Shun of high antiquity, this was like really key on the agenda for education, so much so that the Minister for Education was appointed simply to ensure that these 5 instructions, these teachings, were promulgated throughout the kingdom. And he says, learning is a matter of learning these, and that is all. So this education is humanistic. It's simply about ensuring that these relationships that we have, people that we interact with on a daily basis, that we get it right. And I'll use a very, very simple example. The first one, between parent and child, there should be affection, which I think not many people would disagree with. The parent and child relationship is the first bond that we have, isn't it, in our lives? And parents are naturally affectionate towards their children. They want the best for their children. But how should they be affectionate? What's the line between, spoiling one's child and simply sort of loving them? And this is where the learning comes in, because without some guidelines, or without this going back to these classics and understanding this and learning this, sometimes we can confuse right and wrong, as it states in the Exalted Treatise. So, true story of a couple whom I know. They are now in their 70s, but they had 2 sons, and one of the sons, the eldest son, was actually quite intelligent, very bright, from a very young age, was, always top of the class, very hardworking, of course, as well. In contrast, his younger brother would always, at times would even skip school and would not necessarily put much effort into his schoolwork, and so there was a bit of a difference between the 2 brothers. As a result, the parents would particularly reward the elder child, and in a way sort of try to encourage him, at the same time trying to encourage the younger son as well. So, the elder son had particularly liked spring rolls. Who doesn't? And every time after school, his dad, who was actually a chef, would ensure that he had some spring rolls, and so much so that he didn't really need dinner. He'd just have these spring rolls as his dinner, in a way. And his father thought that this was important to acknowledge and reward his hard work and diligence. This didn't just happen for a few weeks; it happened for several years. And in fact, this eldest son became quite successful, not only at university but also throughout his career. But continued to live at home, and therefore continued to have this kind of very unbalanced diet. And throughout this time, of course, the parents thought that this was fine. This was something that, because of his good work, he should be rewarded, he should be encouraged, and therefore, something as simple as cooking a few spring rolls for him would not be any harm. Unfortunately, at the age of around in his 30s, he developed quite a severe kidney problem and had to have one of his kidneys removed. So actually this person is still alive, but he actually only has one kidney. And, this is due to a very unbalanced diet for several years of his life. Now, no parent would want this to happen to their child. But yet, if you think about it, this affection between parent and child is not just about doing whatever the child wants, because you think that clearly there could be there's no harm. It's about encouraging them. They're obviously a great child already, etc. But there needs to be some sort of standard or guideline. Otherwise, in fact, you could be harming someone without even knowing, thinking that it is just really helping them along and giving them some sort of acknowledgement. So that relationship and the learning behind how it is that we can really love others, whether parents showing affection for their children or children as they get older, really looking after elderly parents. This is something that we need to understand, and certainly these classical texts give us a lot of food for thought and quite a few different ideas and guidelines. And similarly, as you work through the leader and team member, partners, seniors and juniors, and the relationship between friends, there's also a certain kind of understanding, you would say, that's sort of through the corpus of materials in Confucian or Taoism. There's a sort of accumulated knowledge and wisdom that's there that we need to understand so that we can do the best for the people around us. So that's why you can see that this learning is not something that should be taken lightly. Just because the moment that we're born, we have parents, we might have siblings already, so this relationship between seniors and juniors when we go to school, we have friends in the workplace, we have colleagues, leaders, team members, etc. Doesn't mean that we automatically know how to work and relate. And it's something that we need more understanding about. So that's why Dorsey, as the cornerstone of his academy about the true value of education, the self-cultivation, self-development aspect of education, really honed in on these relationships as the core elements. But he doesn't stop there. He continues by explaining how we are to learn these through the texts, obviously. So it says there are 5 steps in the process of learning. And for those of you who've read the Zhongyong, or the Practice of the Mean, one of the 4 books, these 5 steps are taken from that. Okay, so it's not something that Zhuxi himself thought about and made up. So the first step is to study broadly, or sometimes translated as study extensively. Then this extensive study is not just to say, okay, read every book that you can get your hands on, but there's a certain order. As Venerable Master Ching Kung has explained, we start with the foundational texts like the Deeds of Gui, the Guidelines for Learners, what we're learning now, the Exalted Treatise, and from the Buddhist perspective, the foundational text would be the 10 Virtuous Sutra on the 10 Virtuous Conducts. So very clearly, they, through very accessible language, very concise language, explain, what it is that we should be paying attention to, and they provide sort of instructions on a very practical level. So the broad study begins with foundational texts, before you then move on to the other canonical works based on your particular tradition. So, for example, in Confucianism, that would be the 4 books. In Taoism, that would be perhaps Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. So these other texts. and so on and so forth. And as you continue learning, your knowledge becomes deeper, more comprehensive, broader, and gives you different ideas on how exactly you're able to think about it and put it into practice. So this broad study means to learn in an order and to go through the text in a systematic, in a detailed way. Just like, in each of these, every week we take a particular line, we elaborate on it. Yes, that might include sometimes reading other parts of other texts, but it's all with the purpose of trying to understand this particular sentence, and coming back to the sentence rather than jumping to another text and starting that other text from beginning to end. So it all sort of focuses on this one text when you are studying that particular book. So that's broad study. The second step is when you are studying. If you have any questions, if you're not clear about definition of a particular word or the phrase, how it relates to the phrases before or after, how do these sentences come together? Why are they put in that order? How is it that I can actually put it into practice? Then you need to ask questions. So to accurately inquire, even from at the Confucian learning, encourages us to get our questions answered. Ask the right people, your teachers or colleagues or friends who've much more further along the path, to provide accurate answers. So, very much in contrast to what people think about Confucianism as the traditional form of education, as some sort of rote learning where it's very passive, there's no questions. In fact, when you look at the classical texts, it encourages you to ask. So accurately inquire. The third step then is to think carefully. So once we have the answer, look back at the main text. Is it what we thought it was? Is there a need to ask someone else? How is it that this is coherent or consistent with the rest of the text? So reflect on the answer and reflect on the text. The fourth step, clearly discriminate or distinguish, is to, having sort of digested that understanding, that meaning, to, as we read through the text, you can see obviously our skills and our knowledge accumulates. So, with the prior learning, prior background knowledge, as we continue our learning, we can always refer back and think about, do the lines after let's say at the end of the text or in the following text in the canon, how does it relate to something before, our prior knowledge? To really clearly discriminate. Is it saying what we think it's meant to say? And if not, continue to ask questions. So every step of the process, you can see, it's very logical. It's probably something we already do when we go to university or we're at school and we know when we're learning. But at the same time, we apply that to how we learn these classical texts as well. So the first 4 steps, as it says, 4 methods of study, inquiry, thinking, and discriminating, are really about the theory, getting the main theory right. So, and this refers to all the different traditions, not just the Exalted Treatise and Taoism. And the 5th step is you would say, the most important step because it's actually applying it. If we just stopped at the first 4 steps, then it would be exactly what we spoke about before, this misunderstanding that maybe it's just some sort of historical study or, philosophizing discourse, and it has no bearing with how we might live our lives. But actually, as you can see, the 5th step is there to tell us that we need to put it into practice. So earnestly practice means to think about practicing in every moment. And simply for the last step, there are additional guidelines in Zhu Xi's principles in his academy. So I've put it in a sort of chart format, which might be easier for us to understand. So as part of earnestly practicing, Josie breaks it down into 3 different aspects of, let's say, daily life. The first is how we think about ourselves and what we do. The second is when we have to do work, whether it's housework, whether it's within the home, whether it's part of our professional lives, or in the community, etc. There's a lot of tasks that we have to manage, that we have to be responsible for. Dealing with affairs is this idea of how do we undertake tasks. And the third is when we interact with others. So you can see, of course, there's how it relates to ourselves, how it relates to things and tasks, and then how it relates to others. So the practice is about our daily lives. It's not just about sitting in a classroom and how we relate to our teacher. So if we look at the very first one, cultivating one's person, and see that he goes into further detail. Okay, it's about our words. Are we trustworthy? Are we honest in what we say? And then how does that translate into our deeds, our actions? Being careful, cautious, mindful. But more importantly, you can see in the third point, it's about our thoughts as well. So it's, cultivating the person is through our words, our deeds, and our thoughts. And the first one is exactly what Confucius had praised Yan Hui for, this idea of anger. Now, here it talks about restraining anger, but I want to be clear that it's not about simply suppressing your anger. Okay, so it's not just saying, okay, well, I have these, this temper welling up inside of me, but because of the occasion, I can't let it out, and therefore I just have to pretend to be friendly with others and pretend that I'm not angry. And that would be simply suppressing one's anger, which is not the case here. It would be more like what we talked about when Yan Hui was able to diffuse that anger, to really sort of nip it in the bud before the emotions inside got the better of oneself. So, to see and realize and detect that anger for what it is, and not be a slave to our emotions. So the restraining anger is to say, well, to diffuse it and realize, even if maybe what other people are doing is wrong, and clearly that's the case because, based on some sort of guidelines that we have, they are not following that. And therefore, as a result, that might impinge on our lifestyle and therefore we become angry. But we have to realize that anger itself does not solve the problem. Anger within ourselves, whether we let it out or not, does not solve the problem. And shouting at someone, getting angry at someone is not as good as actually advising them when your anger has died down and you're calmer. So anger at that particular point in time, if we can detect it, we can diffuse it, and then we can channel it to creative and constructive criticism at a time when the person may, in fact, be more willing to hear and accept our advice. So that's the point here, to recognize that and be clear about what's happening in our minds. On top of that, our thoughts, detect when we become seemingly selfish, when we just think about getting things our way. And, turn that around to thinking about the greater good, strive to goodness, which is what we read earlier in the Exalted Treatise, that yes, we know what's right and wrong, but can we do it? So this is the practice part. In the face of, one's personal interests versus the interests of others, we should strive towards doing good, and that takes practice. And then correcting faults. So like what Confucius said about Yan Hui, not repeating his errors, understanding what went wrong here, and whether it was intentional or unintentional. Let's not do that again. This correcting faults, restraining anger, ceasing this selfishness, only thinking about oneself to the detriment of others. All of these things is about the practice of cultivating oneself. Then, in terms of affairs, both of these points are quite similar in a way. Ultimately, it's telling us that in whatever task that we have to deal with, there's a certain way that things need to be done. And we should do it in the correct and in a careful way without thinking about what's in it for me. Okay, so this is the profit side, or the calculating accomplishment side. That's thinking about what's in it for me. Why do I have to do this? And what it's saying here is, well, in our practice of these teachings, we simply do without thinking about the outcome. Didn't do it conscientiously and diligently. So, if it's for work, if it's a major client, if it's a more recent client, if it's a big customer or a customer with limited means, well, really, if the task is the same, then we should still pay the same attention and caution to the task, rather than thinking about the outcome. Is it for who it's for? That constancy in how we should pay attention to what we do should always be there. And this makes me think of that idea of, regardless of what you do, even if you've done it, to always go back to ground zero, to, regardless of whether it's a big assessment, some big event, or a big project that you've just completed. Well, at the end of the day, the focus is not on what you've done, but what more there is to do. And there's always more to do. There's always more to correct, and always more tasks, whether it's, as I said, within the home or at work. And it's about focusing on what needs to be done rather than what has been done. And if we do that, then we're not thinking about the outcome or, about my self-interest. It's just about making sure that we keep working hard. So this is the practice when we deal with affairs, and that really tests us as to whether we are just thinking about the end result, and are we focused on what needs to be done in the here and now. And thirdly, this practice extends to relating to others. So back to the very first point about our relationships, that when we treat others, we use that golden rule found in many faiths and traditions, that we treat others as we wish to be treated ourselves, care for others as we wish to be cared for ourselves. So do it in a genuine way. And as it says here, when things go wrong, to not blame others, but to think about how I could have done it in a different way, and don't make the same mistake. So these are all sort of very practical ways of thinking about the study, because at the end of the day, after all that's been read and said, it's about how we live our lives. And you can see that these three aspects of the practice that have been sort of put together in Julesi's Principles for Us Academy, then feeds back into the earlier part about the 5 relationships, and that learning is a matter of learning these, and that's all there is to it. So whether you're at home, how you deal with your parents, your children, your siblings, or your partners, your partner, then it's all a matter of how we deal with ourselves and the tasks that we need to do and how we relate to them, and even in the workplace. So you can see that that's all there was to Julesi's articles for learning. That this was what he thought was you could say, the distillation of that learning from a very practical, self-cultivating perspective. Now, as people, as I said, Julesi was 12th century, but these articles for learning were very renowned and very important for learning in late imperial China, right up until the 19th century, say, early 20th century, that late imperial period. And as people sort of tried to apply it in their own learning, in their own academies, they developed it further. And there was another very short essay called The 10 Cautions. So, if you're trying to put into practice Jules' articles of learning, whether it's the earnestly practicing bit or the theoretical bit, the first 4 steps, what are the things that might you have to be cautious that you're not doing? Okay, so these are things that you shouldn't do. A bit like, in the treatise where we talk about the things that you have to be careful of, the misdeeds. So as people were putting into practice these articles for learning, they came up with 10 cautions, which were compiled in the source book of childhood education, the Yangzhen Yigui, a very key text in 18th century China. So, I've just listed it in a very simple form, the 10 cautions. What are they? The first is inferior aspirations. Okay, so when I talk about aspirations here, when we're learning these traditions, say, for example, Confucianism, well, the aim is to become a sage. Taoism, the aim is to become like Lao Tzu, this, again, another great sage. And similarly in Buddhism, the aim is to become a Buddha, to achieve this enlightenment. And anything less than that would be an inferior aspiration, that you're not aiming high enough. You settle for less. Perhaps, the aspiration of simply getting a government official a position in those times would be an inferior aspiration, because you really haven't uncovered all of the potential there is inside yourself. This idea that you could be a sage as well, and really sort of plumb the depths of this learning. So the writing this essay then tells us to guard against that. Don't settle for anything less. Don't be content if you haven't reached that level of being a sage. So that's the first thing. The second is insincerity, is when, we just work on an outer appearance, the appearance of being, polite, genuine. We're really, on the inside, we have no feeling at all towards the other person, towards a particular task. And therefore, there's a inconsistency between what's on how we feel inside and what we show on the outside. And, you could say that we were just putting it on for a show. It's insincerity. Obviously, you can see that it goes against the grain of becoming a more genuine person, how we care for others and caring for others as oneself. So that idea of insincerity is something that we have to be very, very cautious against and keep check on. The third is a lack of respect towards the sages. Now, you might say, well, Confucius hasn't come back to life. How is it that I can be disrespectful towards the sages? Well, just as we saw earlier, there are Confucian temples. Well, these places are established so that we can pay respects. Paying respects is not worshipping him like a deity or a god, but to simply be mindful of the teachings that he has sort of transmitted, teachings that continue to be learned and studied today. So if we visit these places, we should be respectful in these places, but more importantly, the very texts that we have of the Confucian canon, of the Taoist and Buddhist canon, these texts, when we're reading them, if we happen to have physical books in our room, then we should be respectful and wash our hands before we touch the books. We should make sure that when we open these books, it is as if we are listening to the sage himself. So that's the idea of being respectful. The fourth is obviously when we think about teachers and friends, we're talking about the teachers and friends that are related to this form of learning. And, bullying or being irreverent towards them means that you are not able to benefit at all. It obviously doesn't harm the teacher or your friend, but if they're trying to encourage you to do the right thing and you are completely neglectful and ignore them, well, then it's really to your own detriment. So that's something to also be cautious about. The fifth is what I've translated as sort of coming together with friends and not really having much meaningful conversation, simply just getting together for a good time. And obviously that's sort of whittles away the hours, and there's so many things to do that we need to make sure that we manage our time wisely. So that principle actually carries on with from the fifth to the eighth sort of caution here. When you're alone, make sure that you still remain respectful, even if no one is around and you're reading these texts you're trying to cultivate. When you do things, try to, as it says, be cautious about undertaking meaningless activities. And the examples they had were things like, gambling, meaningless gaming, etc. But even more so these days, we have so many things that can distract us. Everyone has a different vice, and it's just a matter of understanding that and making sure that it doesn't take up your time when you could be doing something that is meaningful. So similarly, reading meaningless books these days would also include, social media and going through the, meaningless sort of video clips, etc. And sort of being aware of that. I think all of us are aware of that, but just what's the alternative? We have to present ourselves with a very clear and very interesting alternative so that we can pull ourselves out of that rut. Number 9, competing with classmates. So this kind of study is not about sort of competing as to who's better, who has the better writing, or who seems to be more cultivated, but it's about learning from each other and respecting each other if they happen to be progressing faster in their cultivation, then that's great. And then finally, be cautious if you seem to want to give up, this idea, lack of perseverance, because as we mentioned earlier, it's a lifelong learning. It's not something that can be done within a matter of weeks, 5-week intensive course kind of learning, but something that we might learn in terms of the theory, get it right, but something that in terms of our practice, we never finish in improving ourselves. We can only get better. And I remember in my primary school, the teacher would always give us this motto, which was good, better, best. Never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best. And this idea that, you have to have this constancy and this patience to just keep improving yourself. And, in regardless of which kind of learning that you're undertaking, whether it's professional learning, school learning, or this kind of learning of the different traditions and the classics, it's still the same idea with never giving up and always ensuring that you start afresh every day and you are able to motivate yourself against these 10 things. So we'll end there today, but basically, in order to not confuse right and wrong, we need to have the right attitude towards our learning of these traditions, whether it's Confucianism, Taoism, or Buddhism. And then we have to be constant and persevere in this learning, because if we find that, in the face of knowing what we should do but actually doing the opposite, then we know that our learning is not comprehensive enough. We don't understand it enough that we can change our thoughts and what we're doing. So that's very important. And in order to get it right and not do this, these lines are telling us what to avoid, then we need to have the right attitude. So hopefully we've explored a bit of that today with the learning, and next week we'll talk more about different relationships. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.